What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon466cards, and today we're doing a deep dive into SGC's numbers. In my video last time, I had talked about how while there was a decline in SGC's numbers, the slack was more than picked up by CGC, and it sure seems like that people are shifting away from SGC to CGC. This time, though, I want to do a deeper dive look into what is driving this decline at SGC. And I do want to give a shout out to someone from my comments section. He said that flippers and TCG are leaving. SGC is going back to being vintage specialist, which is fine by me. And I said to the record person, this is a great idea for a video. Thank you for the idea. And so that's what we're doing today, trying to figure out where this decline is coming from. And a lot of this data comes from GemRate and can be found in GemRate's newsletter, which you can sign up for right here under resources on their website. So go sign up right now. Shout out to Ryan at GemRate. Now let's jump right into the data. What I'm going to show you here is three things, three numbers. One is the number of cards submitted in August. One is the number of cards submitted in September. And one is the decrease from August to September. And I'm going to show this to you by decade. And so as an example, here is the 2020s. From August to September, there was a 57% decrease in cards graded at SGC. And so if you are the record keeper who had made that comment in my comment section, this is something that you would expect. A huge decrease in cards submitted from the last 5 years. And if we go back to the 2010s, very similar number, 58%. Again, this is what you would expect if you think that SGC is a vintage specialist. The biggest decreases should come from the most recent decades. As we move to the 2000s, you can see that this is leveling off a bit and going down to 47%, which may or may not be what you expect. As we move to the 1990s, you can see that the number continues to go down to 45%. And so this is kind of following the trend that if you expect SGC to be a vintage expert specialist, that this is what happens, that most of the losses will be from the last 2 decades or so. And as we move to the 1980s, you would expect this number to keep on decreasing. But in fact, it's pretty flat with the 90s and the 2000s at 46%. And so this is a little bit of a troubling trend now. You're not seeing that decline in this percentage that you might expect. But if we move to the 1970s, you can see, okay, this is now down to the 37% level. This makes sense. You know, from the 2020s, it was 57, now we're at 37%. And if this decrease continues on into the 60s and then the 50s, this does sort of feel right. You know, if the numbers for the 60s and the 50s are in that like 25-30% range, that would feel kind of right compared to a 57% decline in the 2010s and 2020s. That's not what we see. In fact, the 1960s also saw a 41% decrease from August to September. And so this is, if you look at this chart, it's an across the board decrease, right? And if I include the 1950s and earlier, it's even more stark, the across the board consistency in the decline. Every decade saw a decrease of at least 37%, which was the 1970s. This isn't just a phenomenon that was solely due to the last 20 years of cards. This is going pre-war, this is 60s, this is 70s. And so while SGC might be vintage specialists, the impact of this decline is across the board. There's no two ways around it. This data is clearly showing that people are submitting or not submitting cards from all decades, not just from more recent years. So that's interesting. I was not expecting this. I was kind of expecting what the record keeper, record submitter, whatever that person's name is, I was expecting his comment to be true, but it doesn't seem like it is. It seems like this is impacting whether cards be submitted to SGC no matter what year it's coming from. Next topic. Let's see what this trend looks like from the past 3 months, or from the past 4 months actually. 4 months, 3 month trend, showing the number of cards, or the percentage of cards actually, graded by SGC for each decade. And so what this chart is going to show you is the number of cards from the 1950s graded in June, July, August, September as a percentage of all cards graded that month. And so enough of me blabbing. This will make sense when I show you the chart. Here we go, fun graphics. And so this light colored bar is June, the next one is July, then August, and the darkest one is September. And so you can see the most obvious change that you can spot here is from the 2020s. And so while there were 35% of cards that were graded in the 2020s in September, that number was above 50% in June and July. And so there is a bigger impact on cards being graded from the 2020s at SGC. There is a decrease and a slow uptick in cards from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? You can see 50s 12% to 16%, 60s is 9 to 12, 70s is 6 to 9, 80s is 6 to 9. Like, this is a pretty consistent, 3 percentage points increase for each decade from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that the increase is because of a big drop from the cards submitted in the 2020s, comprising 52 and 51% in June and July, all the way down to 35% in September. So there has been a decrease in the cards submitted to SGC across the board, but there's been an even bigger decrease from the 2020s. Interesting to note that the 2010s has basically stayed flat, as has the 2000s. Not sure what to make of that, but I thought this was also interesting, that the trend does show a bit of a shift, but still more than a third of cards graded by SGC in September were from the 2020s. That's a lot. That's a lot, right? For a vintage specialist. All right, moving on. We've talked about SGC a lot, but now let's put SGC in context of the 3 other major grading companies, PSA, Beckett, and CGC, and see what that distribution looks like by decade. And if we look at it, the black tuxedo sure pops out. And you can see that in the 2020s category, they are by far the biggest laggard. They by far grade the fewest percentage of cards from that decade. And while this number was 35% here, we know that it was previously above 50%. Even when it was at 50% a couple of months ago, that would still make it well below where the other grading companies are. Conversely, you can see that as a percentage, SGC grades a lot of 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I should say 50s and before the 50s. And it's much more than the other graders as a percentage of all cards graded. And it doesn't matter whether this is 16 or 12 or 9, or if it was a few months ago where the numbers were 12 and 9 and 6, that would still be much higher than the other grading companies. And so this kind of tells us that, yeah, they are vintage experts and that they do a higher proportion of their cards than all the other grading companies. And it's not close, especially for anything from the 70s and before that, right? And so if we bring this to a wrap, what are the conclusions that we can say from the data that we have just reviewed? The first thing is that there has been a significant decrease in SGC sports card grading, and it's not just limited to modern and ultra modern. It is from all time periods, right? There was a decrease from cards that were pre-war, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Every decade was impacted. Second thing is that the cards from the 2020s have seen the biggest decreases in the past 3 months. And finally, SGC is clearly a vintage specialist, as we saw in that last slide there. But the other thing is, they were always a vintage specialist, even 3-4 months ago, as you saw in terms of the percentage of total cards that were graded from the 50s and before, 60s and 70s. That last chart clearly showed that they have always been a vintage specialist, and it is by far away a bigger chunk of their total submissions than the other grading companies. And so that's it. That's the video. Would love to hear and see your comments in the comment section down below. Do you agree with my summary points here? What are your thoughts on the data that I showed you? And again, shout out to Ryan from GemRate. Thank you as always for listening and watching, and I'll talk to you all soon. Cheers.